Duke Jonathan Hales stood in the shadows of the Langston estate, watching the candlelight flicker through the grand windows, his fists clenched with a fury that had burned for 20 years. Tonight, he would begin the destruction of the family that had stolen everything from him. But when a young woman in a sapphire gown stepped onto the terrace, her laughter floating across the gardens like music, something inside him faltered. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know that she was Beatrice Langston, the daughter of his greatest enemy. He didn't know that revenge would taste like ashes the moment he looked into her eyes. And he certainly didn't know that saving her family might cost him his very soul. One question burned brighter than his vengeance. Could a man built on hatred learn to love, or would his past destroy the only future worth having? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The winter of 1824 arrived in London with a cruelty that matched Jonathan Hales's heart. Ice crusted the Thames, and the bitter wind that swept through Mayfair seemed to carry whispers of old debts and older grudges. Jonathan stood before the mirror in his Grosvenor Square townhouse, adjusting his cravat with fingers that never trembled, even when they should. His reflection showed a man of 32 years, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell rakishly across his forehead and eyes, the color of storm clouds. Those eyes had seen too much, remembered everything, and forgave nothing. His valet, Peters, an elderly man who had served the Hales family since before Jonathan was born, watched his master with concern that had deepened over the years. "Your Grace, the carriage is ready, though I must ask once more if this path is truly the one you wish to travel." Jonathan turned from the mirror, his jaw set in a line that could have been carved from marble. "The Langstons destroyed my father, Peters. They whispered their lies in the right ears, turned the investors against him, and watched as our shipping business collapsed. My father died believing himself a failure, his heart giving out before he reached 50. I was 12 years old when I watched them lower his coffin into the ground, and I made a vow that day. Every Langston will know the taste of ruin before I am through." Peters's weathered face creased with sorrow. "Master Edmund Langston is dead these 5 years, Your Grace. The title passed to his son, Lord William Langston, who was but a boy when your father passed. Surely the sins of the father need not visit the son." "William Langston inherited more than a title," Jonathan replied, his voice cold as the frost outside. "He inherited wealth built on my father's corpse, the estate that should have been ours, the businesses that flourished with stolen capital, the very air of respectability they breathe. All of it reeks of betrayal. I have spent 20 years building my fortune, learning every weakness of every man who might be useful to me, and positioning myself where I can strike with precision. Tonight, I attend Lady Rothmore's ball not for pleasure, but for war." The carriage ride through London's gaslit streets gave Jonathan time to review his strategy. He had already begun purchasing the Langstons' debts through intermediaries, companies with names that meant nothing to anyone but him. Their shipping contracts were being quietly undermined, their investments steered toward failure by brokers who owed Jonathan favors. It was a slow poison he was administering, one that would leave the family penniless and disgraced, just as his own had been. Lady Rothmore's ballroom glittered with the cream of society, a sea of silks and jewels that represented enough wealth to feed half of London for a year. Jonathan moved through the crowd with the ease of a predator, noting the faces that turned toward him with interest. His recent elevation to a dukedom, inherited from a distant cousin who had died without heirs, had made him one of the season's most eligible bachelors. The irony wasn't lost on him that the very society which had shunned his bankrupt father now courted his powerful son. "Your Grace!" Lord Pemberton, a rotund man with more ambition than sense, hurried over with his simpering smile. "What an honor to see you this evening. Might I introduce you to my daughter, Miss Caroline? She plays the pianoforte divinely." Jonathan offered the polite nothingness that society required, his attention already drifting across the room to where he had spotted Lord William Langston. The current Lord Langston was a man of perhaps 28, fair-haired and handsome in the way that came from generations of good breeding and better living. He stood surrounded by friends, laughing at some joke, completely unaware that his destruction was walking toward him in perfectly tailored evening clothes. But before Jonathan could reach his target, a commotion near the terrace doors caught his attention. A young woman had stumbled, her heel caught in the hem of her gown, and she was about to tumble directly into the path of a footman carrying a tray laden with champagne glasses. Without thinking, Jonathan moved with the speed that had made him a formidable boxer at Cambridge, catching the woman by her elbow and steadying her just as the footman swerved past. "Oh!" The exclamation came with a breathless laugh, and when she looked up at him, Jonathan felt something in his chest constrict in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. Her eyes were the color of honey lit by sunlight, warm and bright with intelligence and humor. Her hair, a rich chestnut brown, was arranged in an elegant coiffure that nevertheless seemed on the verge of escaping its pins, as though even her hair had too much life to be entirely contained. Her gown was sapphire silk, well made but not ostentatiously expensive, and it suited her in a way that suggested she cared more for comfort than fashion. "Thank you, sir," she said, her smile genuine and unaffected in a way that stood out sharply against the calculated expressions all around them. "I fear I am hopeless with these dancing slippers. My maid insists they are perfectly fitted, but I remain convinced they were designed by someone who harbors a personal grudge against grace and dignity." Despite himself, Jonathan felt his lips quirk into something almost resembling a smile. "Then perhaps we should consider that your maid is in league with the footman, creating deliberate opportunities for dramatic rescue. It would certainly enliven an otherwise predictable evening." Her laugh was like bells, clear and unrestrained. "What a delightfully cynical theory. I shall have to watch her carefully from now on. Are you often this suspicious of household staff, or is it a particular talent you reserve for special occasions?" "I find that suspicion, properly applied, prevents disappointment," Jonathan replied, and then cursed himself internally for letting the bitterness show through. This was merely a distraction, a minor delay on his path toward William Langston. "How terribly sad," the young woman said, and the sympathy in her eyes was so genuine that it caught him off guard. "To live always expecting betrayal must be exhausting. I prefer to believe the best of people until they prove otherwise. It makes for a much happier existence, even if I do occasionally find myself disappointed." "And have you been disappointed often?" Jonathan found himself asking, genuinely curious despite his determination to remain detached. "Often enough to be realistic, but not so often that I have become bitter," she replied. "There is a balance to be struck between wisdom and cynicism, don't you think? Now, I really must thank you properly for saving me from certain humiliation. I am Miss Beatrice Langston, and I am in your debt, Mr." The name hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Langston. This luminous creature with her easy laughter and unguarded eyes was a Langston. The universe, it seemed, had a vicious sense of humor. He should have turned away immediately, should have cut the conversation short with the kind of cold dismissal he had perfected over the years. Instead, he found himself bowing with perfect courtesy and saying, "Duke Jonathan Hales, at your service, Miss Langston." Her eyes widened slightly, recognition and something else, curiosity perhaps, flickering across her features. "The Duke of Ashford, how wonderful to finally meet you. William, my brother, has mentioned you several times. He is most eager to make your acquaintance. Something about a business matter he wishes to discuss." "Oh, there he is now." She turned and waved, beckoning her brother over with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of someone who had never learned to dissemble. Jonathan watched William Langston approach with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. This was his moment, the opening he had been engineering for months. Yet all he could think about was the warmth of Beatrice Langston's arm beneath his hand, the way her eyes had softened with sympathy when he had spoken of suspicion and disappointment. "Your Grace," William Langston executed a perfect bow, his manner friendly but with an underlying tension that suggested he knew exactly how important this introduction was. "What an honor. I had hoped to encounter you this evening. Might I steal a moment of your time to discuss a matter of mutual interest?" "Of course." Jonathan replied smoothly, forcing his attention away from Beatrice, who was watching the exchange with bright curiosity. "Though perhaps we might schedule a more appropriate venue. Lady Rothmore's ballroom seems ill-suited to business discussions." Naturally, William agreed quickly, relief evident in his voice. "Might you call at Langston House tomorrow afternoon? I believe you will find the proposition I have in mind to be quite advantageous to us both." Jonathan inclined his head in agreement, already calculating how he could use this invitation to further his plans. He would see the inside of Langston House, meet the family, identify their weaknesses with the precision of a surgeon preparing to cut, and when he had gathered all the information he needed, he would strike without mercy. "I look forward to it," he said, and meant it, though perhaps not in the way William Langston hoped. "Splendid!" Beatrice clapped her hands together with childlike delight. Then you simply must stay for tea as well. Cook makes the most wonderful lemon cakes, and I have been dying to hear more about your travels. William mentioned you spent several years in India, and I am absolutely fascinated by everything I have read about that part of the world. There was no polite way to refuse without giving offense, and Jonathan found himself agreeing before he could fully consider the implications. As the Langstons moved away into the crowd, he stood alone for a moment, his carefully constructed walls of hatred feeling suddenly less solid than they had an hour before. "Trouble, Your Grace." The voice belonged to Lord Marcus Ashworth, one of Jonathan's few genuine friends, and a man who knew more of his history than most. "The Langstons," Jonathan said quietly. "I met the daughter." Marcus, a lean man with shrewd eyes and the bearing of someone who had seen both the best and worst of humanity, studied his friend carefully. And she is nothing like what I expected." Jonathan watched Beatrice across the room, saw her laughing with a group of young ladies, completely at ease and apparently beloved by those around her. "She is kind, Marcus, genuinely kind, not the calculated kindness that society teaches, but something real and unaffected." "Kind people can still be the children of villains," Marcus observed. "Your quarrel is with the father who wronged yours, not with the innocent daughter who knew nothing of it. There are no innocents in this, Marcus. She has lived her entire life in comfort, purchased with my family's suffering. Every gown she wears, every meal she eats, every moment of security she enjoys exists because her grandfather destroyed mine. How can I look at her and not see the price paid for her happiness? Perhaps," Marcus said slowly, "because she is not her grandfather, nor even her brother. Perhaps because judging a person by their relation rather than their character is exactly the kind of injustice you claim to be avenging." Jonathan had no answer for that, and so he said nothing, merely watching as Beatrice Langston danced with a young lieutenant, her face alight with innocent joy. Something twisted in his chest, something that felt dangerously like regret for a revenge not yet taken. The next afternoon arrived with pale winter sunlight that did little to warm the frost-crusted streets. Jonathan's carriage rattled through Mayfair toward Langston House, and with each turn of the wheels, he reminded himself of his purpose. This was reconnaissance. He would smile and play the interested business partner, all while cataloguing every asset, every vulnerability, every possible avenue through which he could pour his carefully prepared destruction. Langston House was a fine Georgian building on a tree-lined square, its brick facade elegant without being ostentatious. It spoke of old money and older respectability, the kind of establishment that had weathered generations without scandal. Jonathan intended to change that. He was shown into a drawing room decorated in shades of blue and cream, tasteful and comfortable in a way that suggested the Langstons cared more for livability than showing off their wealth. William Langston greeted him with every sign of pleasure, and for the next hour they discussed business with the careful dance of men who each wanted something from the other. William was looking for investors in a new shipping venture, one that would expand the family's already considerable merchant fleet into trade routes along the African coast. It was, Jonathan had to admit, a sound business proposition, the kind that would likely turn a healthy profit for everyone involved. It was also exactly the kind of venture Jonathan intended to sabotage. He had already made arrangements with competitors, ensured that key ports would be closed to Langston ships, planted rumors about the family's financial instability that would make other investors nervous. All he had to do was pretend interest, perhaps even commit some capital to avoid suspicion, and then watch as the entire enterprise collapsed around William's ears. "I believe we could achieve remarkable things together, Your Grace," William was saying, his expression earnest. "The Hales name once stood for innovation and integrity in British shipping. I would be honored to see it restored to prominence through our partnership." The words were clearly meant as a compliment, an olive branch extended between two families whose histories had once been intertwined. William Langston had no idea that he was offering partnership to a man who had spent 20 years planning his destruction. Jonathan was formulating his response, something non-committal but encouraging, when the drawing room door opened and Beatrice entered carrying a tea tray. "Mrs. Henderson is dealing with a minor crisis in the kitchen involving a collapsed soufflé and the butcher's boy," she announced cheerfully, setting the tray down with only a slight clatter. "So I have taken it upon myself to ensure our guest is properly refreshed. I do hope you like your tea strong, Your Grace. I never understood the appeal of that pale, watery stuff that some people call tea." Jonathan found himself on his feet, taking the cup she offered with a murmured thanks. She had changed from last night's ball gown into a day dress of soft green muslin that made her eyes seem more gold than brown. Her hair was still escaping its pins in places, giving her a slightly disheveled air that was entirely charming. "I am sorry to interrupt business talk," she continued, settling herself into a chair with the kind of graceful unconcern that suggested she was entirely comfortable in her own home. "But William has a terrible habit of forgetting that guests require sustenance, and I feared you might expire from thirst before he remembered his manners." "I do not forget my manners," William protested, but there was affection in his voice. "You simply have no patience for the natural course of business discussion." "Quite right," Beatrice agreed without shame. "I find business discussions to be among the most tedious activities ever devised by mankind, exceeded only by embroidery and listening to Miss Hartwell sing. No offense intended toward your business acumen, Your Grace, but I would much rather hear about the time you supposedly rescued 3 children from a burning building in Calcutta." Jonathan nearly choked on his tea. "Where did you hear that story?" "Lady Rothmore mentioned it last night," Beatrice replied, her eyes dancing with amusement. "She said you were quite the hero, though you never speak of it yourself. I believe her exact words were that you possess an almost irritating tendency toward modesty about your better qualities." "Lady Rothmore talks too much," Jonathan muttered, feeling unaccountably flustered. The incident in Calcutta had been years ago, and he certainly hadn't undertaken it for recognition. 3 children had been trapped in a warehouse fire near the docks, and he had happened to be nearby. Any decent human being would have done the same. "So it is true." Beatrice leaned forward, her whole attention focused on him with an intensity that was both flattering and unnerving. "You must tell me about it. Were you frightened? How did you know where to find them? What did their parents say afterward?" "You are overwhelming His Grace," William interjected, though he was smiling. "Not everyone shares your enthusiasm for dramatic retellings of heroic events. On the contrary," Jonathan heard himself saying, "I find Miss Langston's curiosity refreshing. Most of society is far too concerned with appearing sophisticated to express genuine interest in anything." For the next half hour, he found himself telling the story, though he downplayed his own role as much as possible. Beatrice listened with rapt attention, asking questions that showed real intelligence and empathy. She wanted to know about the children afterward, whether they had recovered fully, whether their family had been able to rebuild their home. When he mentioned that he had quietly arranged for their resettlement and education, she looked at him with such warm approval that he felt something in his chest crack. "That was truly good of you," she said softly. "Many men would have considered the rescue sufficient and moved on with their lives. To care about what happened to them afterward shows real compassion." Jonathan wanted to tell her not to think well of him, that he didn't deserve her good opinion, that he was in her home under false pretenses with the express intention of destroying everything her family held dear. Instead, he simply inclined his head and accepted her praise like the fraud he was. As the afternoon wore on, William excused himself to deal with some estate business, leaving Jonathan and Beatrice alone in the drawing room. Propriety suggested that she should leave as well, or at least that a chaperone should be summoned, but she seemed unconcerned with such niceties, and Jonathan found he had no desire to remind her of them. "May I ask you something impertinent, Your Grace?" Beatrice asked, refilling his teacup without waiting for an answer. "You may ask," Jonathan replied cautiously, "though I reserve the right not to answer." "Why do you seem so sad?" The question was asked with such gentle concern that it bypassed all of Jonathan's defenses. "Oh, I know you smile and say all the right things, but there is something in your eyes that speaks of old wounds and older sorrows. I do not mean to pry, but I cannot help but notice, and I cannot help but care." For a long moment, Jonathan said nothing, couldn't have spoken even if he wanted to. This young woman, this daughter of his enemies, saw him in a way that no one else had in years. She looked past the title and the carefully constructed facade to the hurt that still lived beneath, and instead of exploiting that vulnerability as any sensible person would, she offered only compassion. "I lost my father when I was young," he finally said, which was true enough without being the whole truth. "There are some losses that never fully heal, no matter how much time passes. I never knew my mother," Beatrice said quietly. "She died when I was born. Father always said I had her eyes and her spirit, but I think perhaps that was simply his way of keeping her alive in his memory. He passed 5 years ago, and not a day goes by that I do not miss him. So yes, I understand something of losses that never heal." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, two people bound by grief if nothing else. Jonathan wondered what Edmund Langston had been like as a father, whether he had told his daughter bedtime stories and held her when she cried, whether he had been a good man in his private life, even while being a villain in business. It was easier to hate an abstract enemy than to acknowledge the complexity of human nature, but Beatrice made everything complicated simply by existing. "Do you paint, Your Grace?" she asked suddenly, the change of subject so abrupt that it took him a moment to adjust. "I beg your pardon. Paint? With watercolors or oils? Do you paint?" She was standing now, moving to a corner of the room where an easel stood draped with a cloth. "I only ask because I have found that people who have suffered great losses often seek some form of creative expression. It is as though the pain inside needs an outlet beyond words." She pulled away the cloth to reveal a canvas covered in bold strokes of color that resolved into a landscape, a view of the countryside that was rendered with more passion than technical skill, but was nonetheless arresting. The sky was too vivid, the trees too wild, but there was an emotional truth to it that perfect technique could never have captured. "This is yours?" Jonathan asked, moving closer to examine the painting. "My latest attempt," Beatrice confirmed. "I am not very good, I am afraid. My art master despairs of ever teaching me proper proportion and perspective. But I find that when I am troubled or sad, putting brush to canvas helps me make sense of my feelings, even if the result is somewhat chaotic." "It is beautiful," Jonathan said, and meant it. "Not despite the chaos, but because of it. You have captured something real here, something that perfect technique would have smoothed away." Beatrice turned to him with a smile that could have lit the entire room. "Do you really think so? How wonderful. Most people simply say it is nice and then hurriedly change the subject. You are the first person who has understood what I was trying to do." "Perhaps we are more alike than either of us realized," Jonathan said quietly, and then wondered where those words had come from. He was nothing like Beatrice Langston. She was all light and warmth and generous spirit, while he was darkness and cold calculation and carefully nurtured resentment. Wasn't he? The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 4, reminding Jonathan that he had already stayed far longer than a business call warranted. He made his excuses, promised William that he would consider the shipping investment carefully, and tried very hard not to look at Beatrice as he left. But at the last moment, as he was stepping into his carriage, he glanced back and saw her watching from the drawing-room window, her hand raised in a small wave that pierced through his armor, like an arrow finding its mark. "Langston House, Your Grace?" Peters asked, settling into his seat. "How did it proceed?" "According to plan," Jonathan lied, staring out at the passing streets without really seeing them. "Everything is proceeding exactly according to plan." But that night, alone in his study with a glass of brandy and the silence for company, Jonathan admitted to himself that he was in trouble. He had expected the Langstons to be everything he remembered from childhood whispers and reconstructed history: pompous, cruel, indifferent to the suffering they had caused. Instead, he had found William to be earnest and somewhat naive, genuinely believing that a partnership might be mutually beneficial. And Beatrice was everything he had not expected and could not defend against. She was kind without calculation, curious without being intrusive, and possessed of a warmth that made him remember what it felt like to be human rather than simply a vehicle for revenge. When she looked at him, she saw not a duke or a potential business partner, but simply Jonathan, a man carrying old wounds that perhaps deserved to heal rather than fester. "I cannot afford this," he told the empty room. "I cannot afford to see them as people rather than symbols. If I acknowledge their humanity, their decency, their right to happiness, then what becomes of everything I have built my life upon? What becomes of the promise I made to my father's grave?" No answer came, only the ticking of the clock and the whisper of coals settling in the fireplace. Jonathan poured himself another brandy and tried to reconstruct his resolve, but he kept seeing Beatrice's eyes, warm with sympathy and bright with unshed tears, when she spoke of her own lost parent. Over the next several weeks, Jonathan became a regular visitor to Langston House, ostensibly to discuss business details with William, but increasingly finding himself drawn into conversations with Beatrice. She had a way of appearing whenever he arrived, always with some excuse about needing to retrieve a book or check on the flowers or deliver a message. But her real purpose was transparently to engage him in conversation, and he found himself powerless to resist. They talked about everything and nothing. She told him about her childhood spent largely in the countryside, about the horse she had loved and lost, about her dreams of traveling to places she had only read about in books. He found himself sharing more than he intended. Stories of his time at Cambridge, his travels through India and the Far East, the businesses he had built almost by accident while searching for purpose beyond revenge. "You have done extraordinary things," Beatrice told him one afternoon in late February as they walked through the Langston gardens despite the cold. The first crocuses were pushing through the frozen ground, small purple promises of spring. "Why do you speak of it all as though it means nothing?" "Perhaps because it was never what I truly wanted," Jonathan replied before he could stop himself. They had reached a stone bench overlooking a fountain that had been drained for winter, and they sat together, their breath misting in the cold air. "I built an empire, accumulated wealth and influence, earned a title that commands respect, and yet I feel as though I have been chasing shadows, pursuing goals that leave me emptier with each achievement." "Then what do you truly want?" Beatrice asked, turning to face him fully. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, making her eyes seem even brighter by contrast. "I thought I knew," Jonathan admitted. "For 20 years, I was certain of my path and my purpose, but lately I find myself questioning everything I believed to be true." "That must be terrifying," she said softly, "to lose the certainty that has guided you for so long." "It is," he agreed, "but it is also strangely liberating, as though I am only now beginning to wake from a long dream and see the world as it actually is, rather than as I believed it to be." Beatrice reached out and took his hand, the gesture so natural and unaffected that he almost didn't notice it until he felt the warmth of her fingers through both their gloves. "Then perhaps this is not an ending but a beginning. Perhaps you are meant for something different than what you imagined, something better." Jonathan looked down at their joined hands and felt the last of his resolve crumble into dust. He had come to the Langston house intending destruction, armed with years of accumulated hatred and carefully crafted plans. Instead, he had found something he had not allowed himself to hope for: connection, understanding, and the stirring of emotions he had thought himself incapable of feeling. He was falling in love with Beatrice Langston, and it was going to destroy everything. "I should go," he said abruptly, standing up so quickly that she startled. "I have stayed too long." "Jonathan," she used his given name without thinking, and the sound of it in her voice nearly broke him. "Have I said something wrong? I did not mean to overstep." "You have done nothing wrong," he assured her, though he could not quite meet her eyes. "The fault is entirely my own. Forgive me." He left her there in the garden, confused and hurt, and hated himself for putting that expression on her face. But he could not stay, could not continue this charade, while knowing what he had set in motion. Already, his plans were bearing fruit. William's shipping venture was facing unexpected obstacles. Contracts were being mysteriously withdrawn. Investors were pulling out based on whispers of the Langston family's declining fortunes. It was all unfolding exactly as Jonathan had engineered it, and the knowledge tasted like poison. That night, Marcus Ashworth found Jonathan in his study, surrounded by papers detailing every aspect of the Langston family's financial situation. "Still planning your grand revenge?" Marcus asked, pouring himself a drink without waiting for an invitation. "What would you have me do?" Jonathan demanded, his control finally breaking. "Walk away? Pretend that the last 20 years meant nothing? My father died disgraced and broken, Marcus. The Langstons built their fortune on his ruin. How can I simply forgive that?" "I am not asking you to forgive," Marcus said calmly. "I am asking you to consider whether revenge will actually give you what you seek. Will destroying William Langston bring your father back? Will it undo the past or heal your wounds? Or will it simply create new suffering to add to the old?" "They deserve to suffer," Jonathan insisted, but the words rang hollow even to his own ears. "Perhaps Edmund Langston deserved to suffer," Marcus allowed, "but he is dead. You cannot hurt him now. You can only hurt his children, who knew nothing of his crimes and have done nothing to deserve your vengeance, except be born into the wrong family." "Beatrice," Jonathan said quietly, the name escaping before he could stop it. "Ah." Marcus settled into a chair, studying his friend with sympathetic eyes. "So that is how the wind blows. You have developed feelings for Miss Langston." "I have fallen in love with her," Jonathan corrected, the admission feeling both like a relief and a death sentence. She is everything good and bright in this world, Marcus. She looks at me and sees someone worthy of her regard, someone better than I actually am. When I am with her, I almost believe I could be the man she thinks she sees. Then perhaps you can be, Marcus suggested gently. Perhaps this is your chance to choose a different path, to be the man she believes you are rather than the vengeful ghost you have made yourself into. Jonathan wanted to believe it, wanted it with a desperation that frightened him. But too many mechanisms were already in motion, too many deals had been struck, too many plans laid. It may be too late, he said. I have set things in motion that I cannot easily stop. William's venture will fail, and when it does, it will take much of the family fortune with it. They will be ruined. Then unruin them, Marcus said simply. You have the power and resources to undo what you have done. It will cost you, certainly. You will have to call in favors, spend considerable capital, perhaps even reveal yourself, and face their judgment. But it can be done if you truly wish it. For a long moment, Jonathan sat in silence, weighing his options and his soul. Everything he had worked for, every sacrifice he had made, every lonely night and bitter day, all of it pointed towards seeing his revenge through to completion. But when he closed his eyes, all he could see was Beatrice's face, the warmth in her eyes, the way she had taken his hand in the garden as naturally as breathing. I do wish it, he finally said. God help me, but I wish it. Even if she can never forgive me for what I intended, even if I lose her regard forever, I cannot be the instrument of her pain. I will undo what I have done. The next weeks were a flurry of activity as Jonathan worked to dismantle his own schemes. He contacted every business partner and competitor he had maneuvered into position, offering compensation, trading favors, calling in every debt he was owed to ensure that William Langston's venture would succeed rather than fail. It cost him dearly, not just in financial terms, but in the expenditure of goodwill and influence he had spent years accumulating. More than one business associate expressed confusion at his sudden change of heart, and Jonathan had no explanations to offer, except that he had been laboring under a misapprehension and now sought to correct his error. Through it all, he stayed away from Langston House, unable to face Beatrice while he was still in the process of atoning for sins she didn't even know he had committed. He sent his regrets for several invitations, claiming business that kept him occupied, and tried not to think about how much he missed her laughter and her insight and the way she made him feel like someone worth knowing. It was mid-March when William Langston appeared at Jonathan's door, his face bright with excitement and relief. Your Grace, I had to come tell you personally. The venture, it is succeeding beyond all expectations. Every obstacle we faced has somehow resolved itself, and we have more investors than we can accommodate. It is as though Providence itself decided to smile upon our endeavors. Jonathan managed a smile that felt more like a grimace. I am pleased to hear it, Lord Langston. You deserve the success. I cannot help but feel that you have had some hand in it, William said, his expression turning shrewd. Several of the investors mentioned your name, said you had given a personal recommendation. I do not know what I have done to earn such support, but I am deeply grateful. You have done nothing, Jonathan said truthfully. The gratitude, if any is due, should run in the opposite direction. But I am glad that matters have turned out well for you. William regarded him with an expression that suggested he understood more than he was saying. You know, when I first hoped to make your acquaintance, it was because I felt there was something unfinished between our families. My father, toward the end of his life, spoke often of regrets. He mentioned your father, said that there had been a great misunderstanding, a business matter that went terribly wrong through malice and miscommunication. He said he had tried to reach out, to make amends, but your father had died before he could. Jonathan felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. What manner of misunderstanding? I do not know all the details, William admitted, but I know that my grandfather, Edmund, was involved in something dishonorable, something that cost your family dearly. My father discovered the truth only after my grandfather's death, and the knowledge troubled him greatly. He wanted to make restitution, but he did not know how to reach you, and then he fell ill. On his deathbed, he made me promise to seek you out if ever the opportunity arose, to tell you that the Langston family was not proud of what had been done, and that if there was any way to make amends, we would do so gladly. The words hit Jonathan like physical blows, each one dismantling another piece of the edifice he had built his life upon. Your father, he wished to make amends with his dying breath, William confirmed. He said the guilt of it had poisoned his last years, that he could not go to his grave in peace knowing that an injustice remained unaddressed. So if there is anything at all that I can do to right old wrongs, you need only ask. Jonathan stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the square without really seeing it. Everything he had believed, every justification for his planned vengeance, had just been revealed as at best incomplete and at worst entirely false. The Langstons had not been the heartless villains of his imagination. They had been flawed humans who had recognized their mistakes and sought to atone for them, and he, in his arrogance and pain, had almost destroyed innocence in pursuit of a justice that was itself unjust. "There is something you can do," Jonathan said finally, turning back to face William. "You can listen to what I have to say, and you can decide whether you can ever forgive me for what I nearly did to you and yours." And so he told the story, all of it, his father's ruin and death, his own years of planning revenge, the schemes he had set in motion to destroy the Langston family business, and finally, his realization that he had been wrong, his desperate efforts to undo the damage before it could be completed. William listened in silence, his expression moving from shock to anger to something that might have been understanding or at least the beginnings of it. "You would have ruined us," William said when Jonathan had finished. "Destroyed everything our family had built, left Beatrice and me penniless and disgraced, all because of something my grandfather did before I was even born." "Yes," Jonathan said simply. "There is no excuse for it, no justification that holds up under examination. I was a fool and a villain, and I can only say that I am profoundly sorry, and that I have tried to undo what I set in motion." "Why?" William asked. "Why did you change your mind? Was it the business opportunity? Did you decide we might be more useful as partners than as victims?" "It was Beatrice," Jonathan admitted. "I met your sister, and she made me see myself as I truly was, not the righteous avenger I imagined, but simply a bitter man nursing old wounds and calling it justice. She made me want to be better, even though I had no right to her good opinion." William was silent for a long time, and Jonathan stood waiting for judgment, accepting that whatever came, he had earned it. Finally, the younger man spoke. "My sister has excellent judgment in people. If she saw something in you worth caring about, then perhaps there is hope for you yet. I am angry, Your Grace. I would be lying if I said otherwise. But I am also aware that you could have completed your revenge, and we would never have known until it was too late. The fact that you chose to stop, to make restitution even at great cost to yourself, suggests that perhaps you are not beyond redemption." "I do not deserve your forgiveness," Jonathan said. "Probably not," William agreed. "But I choose to give it anyway, or at least to try. Not because you have earned it, but because I believe in giving people the chance to become better than they were. That said, you need to tell Beatrice. She deserves to know the truth, all of it." The thought of facing Beatrice with the full weight of his sins laid bare terrified Jonathan more than anything he had ever done. But William was right. She deserved the truth, even if it meant losing her forever. "I will," he promised, "though I suspect she will not be as forgiving as you have been." "You underestimate my sister," William said. "But that is a conversation you will need to have with her yourself." Beatrice was in the music room when Jonathan was shown in the next afternoon, playing the pianoforte with more enthusiasm than technical skill. She stopped when she saw him, her face lighting up with a joy that made his heart ache. "Jonathan, I thought perhaps you had forgotten where we lived. You have been absent so long." "I could never forget," he said quietly. "Beatrice, there is something I need to tell you. Something you need to know about who I am and what I have done." The joy faded from her face, replaced by concern and something that might have been fear. "You sound so serious. Whatever it is, surely it cannot be as terrible as you seem to think." "I fear it is worse," Jonathan replied. "But you deserve the truth, all of it, and when I have told you, you will have every right to despise me and wish me gone from your life forever." He told her everything, just as he had told William, holding nothing back. He spoke of his father's death, his years of planning revenge, his cold calculation in approaching her family, his schemes to destroy them financially. He told her about the shipments he had sabotaged, the investors he had frightened away, the web of destruction he had so carefully woven. And he told her about how meeting her had changed everything, how her kindness and warmth had shown him the hollowness of his vengeance, how loving her had taught him that some things were more important than nursing old grievances. Beatrice listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each revelation. When he finally finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. Jonathan stood waiting, prepared for her anger, her disgust, her righteous condemnation. He deserved all of that and more. "You loved your father very much," she finally said, her voice quiet but steady. Of all the responses he had expected, that was not one of them. Yes, he was everything to me. Losing him as I did, watching him die, believing himself a failure, it broke something in me. "I can understand that," Beatrice said, looking up at him at last. Her eyes were bright with tears, but there was no hatred in them, only sadness. "When my father died, I felt as though a piece of my soul had been torn away. I would have done almost anything to have him back, to undo the unfairness of his death. So I understand the impulse toward vengeance, the desire to make someone pay for the pain you suffered. But you did not let it consume you," Jonathan pointed out. "You chose to live in the light rather than darkness." "I had William," Beatrice said simply. "I had family and friends who reminded me that life was still worth living, that there was still beauty and joy to be found, even in the midst of grief. You had no one. You were alone with your pain, and so it festered into something poisonous." "That does not excuse what I did," Jonathan insisted. "I nearly destroyed innocent people in pursuit of revenge against someone who was already dead." "No, it does not excuse it," Beatrice agreed. "But it helps me understand it. Jonathan, what you planned to do was unforgivable, but you did not do it. When you realized you were wrong, when you saw that your vengeance would harm innocence, you stopped. You chose to undo the damage even though it cost you dearly. That has to count for something." "Does it?" Jonathan asked, hardly daring to hope. "Can you truly forgive what I intended, even if I did not carry it through?" Beatrice stood and crossed the room until she stood directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the tears on her lashes. "I do not know," she said honestly. "I need time to think, to feel, to understand what this means. But I know that I do not hate you, Jonathan. I am hurt and disappointed and confused, but beneath all of that, I still see the man who rescued children from a fire, who speaks of his pain with such honesty, who listened to my foolish chatter about painting and travel as though it mattered. That man is worth knowing, worth caring about. I just need to reconcile him with the man who would have destroyed my family." "Take all the time you need," Jonathan said. "I have no right to ask for anything from you, least of all forgiveness. But know that I am profoundly sorry, and that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of whatever regard you might still hold for me." He left then, before he could say anything more, before he could beg or plead or try to influence her decision. As he climbed into his carriage, he looked back one last time and saw her standing in the window, her hand pressed against the glass in a gesture that might have been farewell or might have been something else entirely. The weeks that followed were the longest of Jonathan's life. He continued to work on ensuring that William's business venture would succeed, using every resource at his disposal to guarantee the Langstons' financial security. It was the least he could do, a penance that barely scratched the surface of what he owed them. But it was something, a small step toward becoming the man Beatrice had believed him to be. Marcus visited often during this time, providing companionship and a sounding board for Jonathan's tumultuous thoughts. "You did the right thing," he said one evening, as they sat in Jonathan's study, telling them the truth. It would have been easier to simply fade away, to let them believe your change of heart was genuine without the taint of your original intentions. "Easier, perhaps," Jonathan agreed, "but not honest. And I have had enough of living with lies and secrets. If I am to have any hope of being the man I wish to be, it must start with honesty, no matter how painful." "Have you heard from Miss Langston?" Marcus asked gently. Jonathan shook his head. "Nothing. I do not expect to. She has every right to her silence, to cut me from her life entirely. I destroyed any trust between us before it could even properly form." "And yet you hope," Marcus observed. "I can see it in your eyes, even as you speak of not expecting anything. You hope that perhaps she will find it in her heart to forgive you." "I am a fool," Jonathan said with a bitter laugh. "But yes, I hope. Against all reason and evidence, I hope. Because the alternative, a life without her in it, even as just a friend, is too bleak to contemplate." As winter gave way to spring, London blossomed with new life, and Jonathan tried to do the same. He involved himself in charitable works, particularly those focused on helping children and families who who had fallen on hard times. He sponsored apprenticeships for boys who might otherwise have ended up on the streets, funded a school for girls whose families could not afford education, and quietly paid off debts for families facing ruin. It was not atonement. Nothing could truly atone for the harm he had intended, but it was something constructive to pour his energy into. It was on a bright April morning that Peters announced Miss Beatrice Langston had called and was waiting in the drawing room. Jonathan's heart, which had been beating normally just moments before, suddenly felt like it was trying to escape his chest. He took a moment to compose himself, straightened his waistcoat unnecessarily, and then walked to face whatever judgment awaited him. Beatrice stood by the window, looking out over the square. She wore a dress of pale yellow muslin that made her seem to glow in the spring sunlight, and when she turned to face him, he saw that she looked different, older somehow, as though the weeks apart had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with years. "Beatrice," he said, and then stopped, not knowing what else to say. "I have been thinking," she began without preamble. "For weeks now, I have thought of little else. I have been angry with you, hurt by your deception, disappointed that the man I thought I knew was built on lies and hidden intentions. I have questioned my own judgment, wondered how I could have been so blind to your true nature." Jonathan felt each word like a knife, but he stood silent and took what he deserved. "But the more I thought," Beatrice continued, "the more I realized that I was not blind, not really. The man I came to know, the man who spoke of his pain with honesty, who listened to my foolish ramblings with genuine interest, who looked at my terrible paintings and found beauty in them, that man was real. Exists. He is standing before me now." "Beatrice," Jonathan started, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Let me finish, please. I realize that people are not one thing or another, not wholly good or wholly evil. We are all of us complicated, carrying both light and darkness within us. You carried a terrible darkness, the desire for vengeance that consumed you for years, but you also carried light, the capacity for love and growth and change. When those two aspects of yourself came into conflict, when you were forced to choose between revenge and redemption, you chose redemption. That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," Jonathan said quietly. "Meeting you saved me from becoming a monster. You showed me what I was losing by holding on to my hatred." "I do not want to be the woman who saved you," Beatrice said, and Jonathan's heart sank. But then she stepped forward and took his hands in hers. "I want to be the woman who loves you, all of you, the darkness and the light together. I want to be the person you choose to be better for, not because you owe me or because you need to atone, but because you want to build something good together." "Are you saying," Jonathan hardly dared to breathe the words, "that you forgive me?" "I am saying that I understand you," Beatrice corrected gently. "Forgiveness is not a single moment but a process, one that we will have to work through together. There will be days when I am angry all over again, when the hurt feels fresh, when I question whether I am making a terrible mistake. But yes, Jonathan, I am choosing to forgive you, choosing to believe that the man you are becoming is worth the risk." Jonathan pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she might disappear if he let go. "I do not deserve you," he whispered into her hair. "I do not deserve your faith or your forgiveness or your love. But I swear to you, I will spend every day of the rest of my life trying to earn them." "You do not need to earn love," Beatrice said, pulling back just enough to look up at him. "That is the whole point. Love is not a transaction or a reward for good behavior. It is a choice, freely given, despite all logic and reason. And I choose to love you, Jonathan Hales, with all your flaws and past mistakes and complicated history." He kissed her then, pouring into that kiss all the gratitude and wonder and desperate hope that he could not find words to express. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and smiling, he rested his forehead against hers and said, "Marry me, Beatrice, not because it would be socially advantageous or because I need to make amends to your family. Marry me because I cannot imagine facing the future without you beside me, because you make me want to be better than I ever thought I could be, because I love you more than I knew it was possible to love anyone." "Yes," Beatrice said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you. Though I warn you, I am still terrible at embroidery and I will probably always be hopelessly clumsy in dancing slippers." "I would not have you any other way," Jonathan assured her, "though perhaps we should invest in several extra sets of champagne glasses just to be safe." They announced their engagement a week later. to the surprise and delight of most of society. There were whispers, of course, there always were. Some said it was a love match, others suggested that the Duke of Ashford was marrying beneath him, and still others speculated about business arrangements and financial motivations. Jonathan and Beatrice ignored them all, secure in the knowledge that they understood the truth of their relationship, even if no one else did. William gave his blessing with genuine warmth, though not without a private conversation with Jonathan, in which he made it very clear that if Jonathan ever hurt his sister, title or no title, there would be consequences. Jonathan accepted this with good grace and the private acknowledgement that William would be entirely justified in whatever revenge he might choose to take. The wedding was planned for June, a small affair by society standards, but large enough to include family and close friends. As the day approached, Jonathan found himself nervous in a way he had never been about anything else. This was not a business negotiation or a social maneuver. This was the beginning of the rest of his life with the woman who had saved him from himself. On the morning of the wedding, Marcus found Jonathan pacing in his dressing room. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Not about marrying Beatrice," Jonathan said, "but about whether I have any right to the happiness I am about to claim. There are people whose lives I damaged in pursuit of my revenge, Marcus. Business rivals I destroyed, investors I ruined, families who suffered because I was so focused on my own pain that I could not see beyond it. How do I reconcile the life I am building with Beatrice with the wreckage I left behind?" "You do not reconcile it," Marcus said simply. "You acknowledge it, you make what amends you can, and you live better going forward. That is all any of us can do, Jonathan. We are all works in progress, all trying to be better than we were yesterday. The fact that you recognize the harm you have caused and wish to address it means you have already come further than most men ever do." "I want to be worthy of her," Jonathan said quietly. "She believes in me so completely, sees the best version of myself even when I cannot. I want to live up to that belief." "Then do so," Marcus advised. "Not by being perfect, which is impossible, but by continuing to choose love over hatred, growth over stagnation, and forgiveness over revenge. You have already proven you can do this. Now you simply need to keep doing it, every day, for the rest of your life." The ceremony was beautiful in its simplicity. Beatrice walked down the aisle on William's arm, wearing a gown of white silk that made her look like something out of a dream. But it was her eyes that captured Jonathan's attention, warm and bright and full of love that he had done nothing to deserve but everything to cherish. When the vicar asked if he would take Beatrice to be his wife, Jonathan answered with a firmness that surprised even himself, "I will." Two simple words that contained a promise more binding than any contract, more sacred than any vow of revenge he had ever made to his father's memory. And when Beatrice answered the same question, her voice rang out clear and certain, "I will." And Jonathan felt the last chains of his past fall away. The wedding breakfast was a joyous affair, filled with laughter and good wishes from people who genuinely cared about their happiness. Jonathan found himself surrounded by friends, both old and new, and realized with a start that he was no longer the isolated, vengeful man he had been. Beatrice had not just given him her love, she had given him back his life, his capacity to feel joy and hope and connection to others. As evening fell and the guests began to depart, Jonathan and Beatrice found themselves alone for the first time as husband and wife. They stood on the terrace of Jonathan's townhouse, looking out over the lights of London, and he pulled her close, marveling at the miracle that had brought them together. "Are you happy?" Beatrice asked, leaning against him. "More than I have words to express," Jonathan replied honestly. 6 months ago, I was a man consumed by hatred, living only for revenge. Today, I am married to the most extraordinary woman I have ever known, with a future full of possibilities I never allowed myself to imagine. If that is not happiness, I do not know what is. "We will have challenges," Beatrice warned him. "There will be days when the past rises up and causes pain. Days when we struggle to understand each other, or when the weight of what has been seems too heavy to bear. Love is not always easy, but it is always worth it," Jonathan finished. "Whatever challenges we face, we will face them together. I am done fighting alone, Beatrice. I am done carrying burdens that were never meant for one person to bear. You have taught me that there is strength in vulnerability, that allowing others to know our true selves is not weakness, but the greatest courage." "Then let us be brave together," Beatrice said, turning in his arms to face him. "Let us build a life based not on vengeance or regret, but on love and hope, and the belief that people can change, can grow, can become better than they were." "I like the sound of that," Jonathan said, and kissed her beneath the stars, sealing a promise that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with redemption. The months that followed their wedding were a revelation to Jonathan. He discovered that happiness was not a destination but a daily practice, a series of small choices to see beauty rather than ugliness, to offer compassion rather than judgment, to build up rather than tear down. With Beatrice beside him, those choices became easier, not because she made them for him, but because she reminded him why they mattered. They divided their time between London and the countryside estate that came with Jonathan's title, finding joy in both the social whirl of the city and the quiet peace of rural life. Beatrice continued her painting, and Jonathan discovered that he enjoyed simply watching her work, seeing the way her face lit up when she captured exactly what she was trying to express. In the autumn, they learned that Beatrice was expecting their first child, and Jonathan felt a terror and joy so intermingled that he could not separate them. He thought of his own father, of the legacy of pain that had shaped so much of his life, and made a silent vow that he would be different. His children would grow up knowing they were loved, not for what they achieved or who they became, but simply for existing. They would never carry the burden of avenging old wrongs or living up to impossible expectations. "You will be a wonderful father," Beatrice assured him one evening as they sat before the fire, her hand resting on the barely visible swell of her belly. "I see the way you are with the children at the schools you sponsor, the patience and kindness you show them. Our child will be blessed to have you." "I hope I can live up to that faith," Jonathan said. "I never had the chance to know my own father as an adult, to understand him as a man rather than just a parent. I hope our children will know me fully, all of me, and still believe I did my best by them." "They will," Beatrice promised, "because you will tell them the truth about where you came from and the mistakes you made and how you chose to be better. That is the greatest gift we can give them, the knowledge that we are all flawed but capable of growth." The baby, a girl they named Eleanor after Beatrice's mother, arrived in early spring with lungs that suggested she would never have trouble making her opinions known. Jonathan held his daughter for the first time and felt something in his chest crack open, a reservoir of love so deep and pure that it bordered on painful. This tiny, perfect creature depended on him completely, trusted him to keep her safe and help her grow. It was the most terrifying and beautiful responsibility he had ever known. "Hello, Eleanor," he whispered, marveling at her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb. "I promise you, I will do my best to be the father you deserve. I will make mistakes, undoubtedly, but I will always love you, always be honest with you, and always try to do better." Beatrice watched from the bed, exhausted but radiant, and smiled at the picture they made together. "She already has you wrapped around her little finger," she observed. "I suspect she will be as stubborn as her father and as impractical as her mother, which will make for an interesting combination. As long as she is happy and knows she is loved, I care nothing for the rest," Jonathan said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. As Eleanor grew from infant to toddler, Jonathan found himself often thinking about his father and the generational cycle of pain that he had almost perpetuated. He had spent so many years believing that avenging his father was the only way to honor his memory. But he had been wrong. The best way to honor the dead was to live well, to choose love and growth over hatred and stagnation, to break the cycles that bound families to repeating the same mistakes across generations. He visited his father's grave one spring morning, alone, carrying a bouquet of flowers and a heart full of things that needed to be said. "I am sorry, Father," he said, kneeling before the weathered headstone. "I am sorry that I spent so many years nursing hatred in your name. I thought I was honoring you, but I realize now that I was simply using your death as an excuse to avoid living my own life." The wind rustled through the trees overhead, and Jonathan imagined he could hear forgiveness in its whisper. "I have a family now," he continued. "A wife who sees the best in me even when I cannot see it myself, and a daughter who fills every day with joy. I am trying to be the man they deserve, the man you might have wanted me to be if you had lived long enough to guide me. I hope that wherever you are at peace, and that you can forgive me for taking so long to find my own peace." He stayed there for a while, talking to the silence, telling his father about Beatrice and Eleanor, about the businesses he was building and the good works he was supporting, And when he finally rose to leave, he felt lighter than he had in years, as though he had set down a burden he had been carrying for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. That evening, he found Beatrice in the nursery, rocking Eleanor to sleep while humming a lullaby. He stood in the doorway for a moment, simply watching them, his wife and daughter, his whole world contained in one small room. Beatrice looked up and smiled, and he crossed to join them, wrapping his arms around them both. "I love you," he said simply. "Both of you, more than I knew it was possible to love. Thank you for saving me, Beatrice. Thank you for showing me that there was more to life than vengeance and old grudges." "You saved yourself," Beatrice corrected gently. "I simply reminded you that you were worth saving. The rest, the choice to change and grow and become better, that was all you, Jonathan." "Then thank you for the reminder," he amended, "and for staying with me while I figured out how to be human again." Eleanor stirred in her sleep, making a small sound of protest at being discussed, and they both laughed quietly. Jonathan pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the sweet baby scent of her, and sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for this second chance he had been given. Life continued its forward march, as it always did. Eleanor grew and was joined by a brother, Thomas, and then another sister, Charlotte. Langston House saw frequent visits from the Duke and Duchess of Ashford and their growing brood, and William became not just a brother-in-law but a genuine friend. The business partnership between William and Jonathan flourished, built not on revenge or hidden agendas, but on mutual respect and shared vision. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Jonathan and Beatrice returned to Lady Rothmore's ballroom, where they had first met. The occasion was another of her legendary balls, and though they no longer attended every social event, this one held special meaning for them. "Do you remember?" Beatrice asked as they stood near the terrace doors, watching the dancers swirl past in a blur of colour and music. "You saved me from falling into a footman. I thought you were rather mysterious and slightly sad." "I remember thinking you were impossibly kind," Jonathan replied, "and wondering how anyone could be so open and warm in a world that seemed designed to make people hard and cynical." "And do you still think I am impossibly kind?" Beatrice teased. "I think you are exactly as kind as you need to be," Jonathan answered seriously. "Kind enough to see past my faults to the person I could become. Kind enough to forgive what most would consider unforgivable. Kind enough to build a life with me despite knowing the darkness I carried." "You do not carry that darkness anymore," Beatrice said softly. "Oh, I know there are still moments when you struggle with memories of what was and what you almost did. But you are not that man anymore, Jonathan. You are the man who plays horses with his children until his back aches, who funds schools and apprenticeships for those who need a chance, who looks at his wife with love in his eyes even after 5 years of marriage and 3 children. That is who you are now." "Because of you," Jonathan insisted. "No," Beatrice said firmly. "Because of you. I may have been the catalyst, but the change, the real, deep work of becoming better, that was all you're doing. You chose to stop, to turn away from revenge. You chose to make amends. You chose love over hatred. I am proud of you, Jonathan, prouder than I can say." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close despite the curious glances from other guests. "I vowed to ruin your family," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "Instead, you gave me a family of my own, one built on love rather than revenge. You gave me a reason to live rather than just a reason to hate. How can I ever repay that?" "By continuing to be the man you have become," Beatrice answered. "By raising our children with love and wisdom, by living each day with purpose and compassion. That is all the repayment I could ever want." They danced then, moving across the floor with the ease of long partnership, and Jonathan thought about the man he had been 5 years ago, standing in these very rooms, watching the Langstons with hatred in his heart. That man seemed like a stranger now, someone he had known once but no longer recognized as himself. He had come here intending destruction and found redemption instead. He had planned to ruin a family and instead had gained one of his own. And if that was not proof that the universe had a better plan than any human could devise, he did not know what was. As the evening drew to a close and they prepared to return home to their children, Jonathan paused one last time on the terrace, looking out over the gardens where he had once stood in shadows, plotting revenge. Beatrice joined him, slipping her hand into his. "No regrets?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Only that it took me so long to find my way to you," Jonathan replied. "Everything else, every mistake and misstep, every moment of pain and confusion, it all led me here, to this moment, to this life we have built together. How could I regret the path that brought me home? They walked together to their waiting carriage, leaving behind the ballroom and the ghosts of who they had once been. Ahead lay their future, uncertain as all futures were, but faced together with love and hope and the hard-won wisdom that came from choosing redemption over revenge. And if sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, Jonathan still thought about his father and the grief that had shaped so much of his life, it was with peace rather than pain, with gratitude for the lessons learned rather than bitterness about the cost. He had been given a second chance, a rare gift in a world that often refused to forgive or forget. He intended to make the most of it, every single day, for the rest of his life. The end of their story was really just the beginning, the start of a life built on foundations of forgiveness, growth, and love. And if that was not the best revenge against the darkness that had once threatened to consume him, Jonathan did not know what was. He had not just survived his pain, he had transformed it into something beautiful, something worth having. He had, in the end, chosen love. And love, as Beatrice had taught him, was always the answer worth choosing.